For joining us on our last day of International Education Week. We are grateful for the amazing speakers that we've had all week and the incredible moderators and just everyone that's contributed. I cannot say enough good things about the global education team and how much they've contributed. So for those that are newer to us, we are in our inaugural year of our Global Education Award. And that is in recognition of a faculty or staff who makes contributions and commitment to connecting cultural differences between people from diverse backgrounds. And due to COVID, like so many other things, we're not able to do a formal celebration of that recipient. But I did want to recognize that person today. In their nomination, it said that this person has found meaningful ways to integrate global education ideals into their work every day, so far beyond their normal opportunities. Helping us to learn and grow and connect within the college and the community. This person has represented the college and the community at global, international, spiritual events and presentations, and has kept her global ed-related work of publishing in her field and participating in other community events as well. She sets an excellent example for all of us. And that recipient is Dr. Courtney Brentz. We wanted to thank you for all that you do. And we will get this in its frame, but it was not showing up on camera in a frame. So thank you so much for all that you do. And thank you for everyone for being here. And with that, I will turn it over to Courtney and Bridget.
Thanks so much. So we are going to quickly introduce ourselves. So Bridget, do you want to give a quick introduction about who you are and your interests in helping to moderate today?
Yes, I'm Bridget Christensen, and I teach sociology here at SEC. And my cat was trying to join us. I have always had an intense interest about diversity in general, but also including international differences in terms of gender experiences. And I'm so excited for Lima to present for us today.
I'm Courtney Brunson. I'm an associate dean on the Lincoln campus, and my background is in Asian studies. And so that's been my primary interest in international studies and global ed, but I also teach religious studies. And our guest today, Lima Nazrati, is a former student of mine when I taught at UNL. And Lima has since gone to do all these amazing things. She has completed law school from Georgetown. Congratulations. Uh-huh. And she's working with refugees, asylees, and migrants. So thank you, Lima, so much for joining us today. We're so grateful to have you.
Yeah, thank you for having me. That was a very kind intro.
I always tell my husband, like, out of all the students I've had at all various universities, you are the most impressive student I've ever had. So thank you so much.
Wow, this is really good for my ego.
So Bridget and I just have a few questions that we'll kind of go back and forth, and then we'll open this up to conversation. But Lima, can you start by telling us a little bit about your position and the work you're currently doing in New York?
Yeah, absolutely. So like Courtney said, I went to law school after my time at UNL, and I graduated from Georgetown in May. So I'm pretty new to my current position. I started about a month ago, and I work at the International Refugee Assistance Project, which is sometimes better known as IRAP, shorthandedly. And so primarily what I do right now is I'm working with Afghans who are applying for the various visa pathways. I think one of the better known perhaps is the special immigrant visa, which is for people who worked for the US military and government or US contractors. And that can include things like going on missions with the US military and interpreting in real time, or working on infrastructure and engineering projects. So a lot of my client facing work right now is with that population. And then I also mentor what we call pro bono teams. So at law firms, attorneys who don't typically practice immigration or refugee law can choose to offer their services pro bono on projects that organizations like IRAP might create for them. And so I mentor attorneys at those firms who are interested in getting involved in growing and learning about this topic.
Wow, that's fantastic. And your mother was a refugee from Afghanistan, and she was a really bright doctor. Can you tell us a little bit about her work and her journey to the US?
Yeah, my favorite thing to talk about, honestly. So feel free to cut me off if this gets overly effusive, but so my mom, like Courtney said, was from Afghanistan, and was born and raised there, and was born into a family that believed very strongly that everyone should have access to education. And so she went through all school, including medical school in Afghanistan, and became an OBGYN, and then eventually moved into surgery, and through many twists and turns, ended up working after she fled Afghanistan to Pakistan, which is a preview of things I'll say later. She was the chief of a hospital in the refugee camps in Pakistan. And at the time, she was one of the administrators for the only hospital providing care to Afghan women for hundreds of miles, because of fundamentalist groups like the Taliban's opposition to those services being provided. And so that was her sort of professional career. And it was actually sort of an unique path to the United States from that. Typically, I think most Afghans in Nebraska came as refugees after the Taliban officially rose to power. But for my mom, she was working alongside American and British doctors who thought that she could add more capacity to serving the population in the refugee camp. But to get that capacity and skill, she would need to go to a hospital that was better equipped. So she got a scholarship to go to UNMC, of all places. And so she came to the US on a scholarship, fully intending to go back and continue practicing and serving the women of Afghanistan. But by the end of the time she was in Omaha, the situation had so deteriorated. And so she ended up applying for asylum and remaining in the United States. Well, I think you're on mute, Bridget.
Sorry about that. When your mom migrated to the United States, what did she experience regarding acceptance?
Yeah, that's a big question. And I
know we're frozen. Let me.
Okay, did I freeze? Am I back?
Yes.
I'm so sorry. I don't know what the situation with the internet is. It says my connection is unstable. So let me know what that becomes. I'm so sorry. Acceptance. Kind of a mixed bag. Certainly there were people who were very welcoming in the Nebraska nice sense. It's like something we're pretty good at, I like to think. I also think that it was hard to find inroads into communities that are so different than your own. There are a lot of similarities that I can see now, having been born and raised in Nebraska, to Afghan culture. But when I think you're first getting off a plane, it is like hard to find that common ground and see the similarities that are there at their core. My mom was incredibly social and sought community. And so I think she was able to find it. But after 9/11 happened, I do think she faced a huge uptick in Islamophobia and xenophobia around being an Afghan. She faced a lot of severe harassment at work, and then eventually was like let go from the position for undisclosed reasons. And people can have whatever opinion they want to about that. But for her, she felt like a big part of that had been the Islamophobia and xenophobia. And so for me, growing up and observing it, I saw like the full gamut of acceptance, people who were very eager to learn from her and learn about her, and then people who preferred to keep their distance on the basis of her being Afghan.
So if anyone is just joining us, we have the privilege today of talking to Lima Nazrati, who grew up in Nebraska, but is now, she's an attorney in New York working with Afghan refugees and asylees. And we're talking a little bit about her amazing mom who immigrated from Afghanistan. Why did she become a doctor? And did that at all push you to decide to become an attorney?
Yeah, I think for my mom, part of it was, so the timeline of when she was going through schooling, as she was increasing in her education in Afghanistan, the access to women's education broadly was decreasing. And so I think that as she was sort of deciding, what do I want to specialize in? What am I interested in majoring in? She was seeing the marginalization of Afghan women and was trying to think of how best she could serve them while still feeling very intellectually stimulated. Academics were like super big for her. She excelled academically. And I think that medicine was a way to sort of marry those pillars of her identity, as well as like serve people less fortunate than her, because she was born into a relatively financially comfortable family in Afghanistan. And she was also in Kabul, which is the capital city. And as we may know as Nebraskans, the resources you have in more rural areas can be quite disparate. And so she, I think, was passionate about being able to bring medical care to people who were further away from those resources and were seeing their access to education, disappearing day by day. And then to the second part of your question, I do think it circuitously affected my decision to become an attorney. But I actually always wanted to be a doctor growing up. So I planned to do the same thing as my mom. And that was still my plan when my mom passed away when I was in high school. So we never had like conversations that in real time prompted me to be interested in the law. I honestly didn't consider law until it would have been freshman year of college. So when I first met you, Courtney, and for me, I had always planned to go into medicine. After losing my mom, I think the trauma was too fresh around medicine to want to pursue that. And I had to step back and think, okay, like, what was it about medicine that appealed to me? So much of it was the service to communities that reminded me of my mom. And as somebody who was raised by a refugee, I was always paying attention to this population and its rights and its lack thereof rights. And so I think eventually in that way, her going into medicine led me to the law, but I wouldn't have necessarily been able to see that while I was making the decision.
Interesting. Did your mom face any obstacles as an Afghan woman pursuing her degree and as a practicing doctor?
Yeah, so that's an interesting question and kind of goes back to what I was saying of like, as my mom was advancing in school, like when she started school, it was not particularly out of the norm for her to have aspirations of going to university and becoming a doctor. And then like in the timeline of when she was getting toward those stages of her education, the civil wars were happening in Afghanistan where more fundamentalist groups were consolidating power. And so when she started out, these goals were not particularly, revolutionary or out of norm or like met with much surprised reaction. But by the time she was actually attending medical school, she was like keenly aware that it would be an affront to people in power's opinions on what she should be doing. And she felt quite strongly that that was all the more reason to do it and to become a doctor and to serve the women alongside her. So yes and no, like when she started, Afghan women became doctors. They did these things. And then by the time she was actually an Afghan woman doctor, she was facing all sorts of threats and harassment on account of it, which brings up an interesting point, which is that the way we often understand Afghanistan and see Afghanistan represented in regards to the culture around women's rights, at least in my lifetime, it has been fairly homogenous, right? Like my mom fled Afghanistan partially because of the persecution she faced as a professional woman in Afghanistan. But when my mom was born, women enjoyed like full rights as we enjoy them in the United States. The women of Afghanistan actually got the right to vote the year before women in the United States and Great Britain did. And so I think it's interesting to consider my mom ended up serving in positions that were quite high profile and attracted a lot of negative attention. But when she first developed those goals and those aspirations and dreams, it was not on account of them holding that position in society. It just sort of transformed in that way. And she ultimately reached the conclusion that that was, like I said, all the more reason to continue pursuing those goals.
How about you? Have you experienced any obstacles as an Afghan woman pursuing your degree in law?
Yeah, I think I experienced it less so in law school because I went in knowing I wanted to do immigration and refugee law. And therefore, law school, at least at Georgetown, if you go in knowing your sort of smaller scope, you're only really surrounded by other people who are interested in similar professional positions. And so being an Afghan woman was like logical to people around me who were also interested in refugee law because they were also studying the Afghan refugee crisis. There was like not a lot of surprise or disagreement with me being there. I do think that earlier in my education or just in life, there were times when it felt like people couldn't decide if I was like too Afghan to do this or too American to do that. And that for me was really hard to like establish an identity professionally and educationally, but also just personally of like, what does it mean to have like a hyphen in your national identity? Like being Afghan American is like the best way to describe my identity, but then it kind of creates instead of being both, you feel like you're not quite wholly either. And some of the like Islamophobia and xenophobia I talked about before that my mom faced after 9/11, I do think did manifest in some of the professional environments that I was in. Not right when it happened, I was 6, so first grade still went pretty well, but just later on, you could sort of see the a lot of times not malicious reactions, but just the discomfort people had because their only context for Afghanistan was something that was traumatizing to the entire country and also to the entire country of Afghanistan. But I think it manifested in those ways, if anything.
Well, and you're talking a lot about what in sociology we would call intersectionalism, that interconnectedness or interrelatedness of different social groups that a person belongs to and how it impacts their lives. Did being a woman particularly impact you in the same ways that did your mother in terms of your experiences here in the States versus Afghanistan? Or
Yeah, that's a great question. And I do think, intersectionality is such an interesting phenomena in terms of like, would an Afghan man have experienced the same things as me? Would a non-Afghan woman be experiencing them the same way as me? I do think like, at least for me personally, and part of this may be I was the only child of a single mother. So Afghan women was like my whole worldview of Afghans. And so I think like sometimes I myself am guilty of like over homogenizing the Afghan experience and forget that like it is quite different to be an Afghan woman versus an Afghan generally. And it is quite different to be an Afghan woman living in the United States where we enjoy greater access to rights than like my family who are still in Afghanistan, especially the women who would like to pursue an education but can't. I think that being a woman definitely compounded a lot of the isms that like my mom and I both faced, and especially for my mom who pursued obstetrics and gynecology, which is like largely considered women's health and women's medicine oriented. I think womanhood for me had always been so inextricably linked to being Afghan. And it's only as I've gotten older that I've sort of parsed through, what was I experiencing as a woman? What was I experiencing as an Afghan? And what was I experiencing as an Afghan woman? And I don't know that I've fully extracted it in any, what's the word? Like easily expressed or certainly eloquent way. But I do think just to your broader point of like the things we experience as the cross section of all of our identities, certainly like being specifically the collection of demographics that I am made my experience like totally different from somebody who perhaps on paper you would expect to have a fairly similar experience to me, if that answers your question.
Yeah, you did a good job. Thanks.
Well, and kind of a off the cuff follow up of that, I recall from class people really wanting you to have these sections of identity. They wanted you to speak for Islam and to be fully like, I'm going to be the person. And then they wanted you to speak for Afghanistan. And they wanted you to be a single identity. And I remember you and I having conversations about this at the Coho, the
Always.
coffee house in Lincoln, about how hard that was. So can you speak a little bit to that, of how, there's such a push within American culture to have these stereotypes and have you speak as if you are a single voice, but none of us are single voices. So can you talk a little bit about that?
Yeah, I mean, a lot of what you said is like the thesis statement of what my response, which is just that it was really hard to be the Afghan or the Muslim or the Afghan woman or just like brown woman or woman with close ties to the refugee experience for a lot of people in my life, and especially in like classroom settings at UNL. And I'm sure in other like university systems that would be similar. I think what was so hard and something I experienced from a very young age, because I was the only insert identity here in most spaces that I found myself in, was it forced me to have to feel like I was like justifying my existence to people from a very young age. Like when we would learn about the fact that there was a war in Afghanistan, everyone's heads would swivel to look at me because I was like the Afghan that they knew. And then I was sort of like sometimes explicitly, sometimes implicitly prompted to just like speak on that broadly. But not only is it impossible for one person to encapsulate an entire country, I've never been to Afghanistan. And so it also like threw into stark light my own like identity crises around like, how Afghan am I? Like my people or people who look like me are suffering in such an extreme way, and I'm here and like I don't even recognize my experience in their lived experiences, and like that cognitive dissonance was really hard and always like turned up to max volume when people were like, tell us you're the Afghan in the room, like explain everything about a hugely complicated crisis. And I think also it was difficult to then not feel like, even when I received positive affirmations in response to that, or was given opportunities as a result of being the Afghan, like the person who was raised Muslim, the like first generation college student, all of these things, sometimes it was hard to not feel like tokenized in those moments where I was grateful that people wanted to sort of give me a microphone and give me a platform, but also frustrated by the expectations that came along with it, that I could or should purport to speak in grand sweeping ways about anything beyond my own personal experience. And I think it can make it really hard to understand your own identity and your own individualism, because you are so often like impromptu, like there's like a podium in front of you, it feels like, and you're suddenly aware of the stakes of if what you say lands a certain way, like did you just completely change someone's entire impression of every member of a group that you belong to, which wouldn't be fair to me or to any of the other people who share an identity with me.
Yeah, I'm thinking about those expectations, and kind of thinking about what you experienced growing up, what your mom experienced growing up. Can you talk a little bit about differences in expectations, and be that education or career, be it from, first gen immigrant to second gen immigrant, right? Of growing up in Afghanistan compared to the US, however you want to take that, to kind of talk us through that a little bit.
Yeah, I mean, I definitely do, like my upbringing does fulfill the stereotype of like parent who insists that their Asian immigrant child become a doctor and like get their top grades and things like that. So it's kind of funny in ways that like I am recognizable as like a manifestation of something people think they know about like population groups I belong to. My expectations like culturally growing up were such an amalgamation of being Afghan. So there were, and like my family was Muslim. So there were expectations around modesty and around like, diet and practice of religion and things like that. But there were also American expectations of me. So my mom was like very sure of what schools she wanted me to go to. That was like purely, like, I'm sure if you asked any other American mother who felt strongly about like university preferences, it would be the same list. And so it's interesting to consider like which expectations upon me were out of being Afghan, out of being in the United States, out of being the child of a refugee who had to leave everything behind and fight really hard for their access to education and for their rights. So I think like cultural expectations wise, it was just a lot of like pressure that was not being intentionally applied by my mom, but just the keen sense of awareness of everything she had sacrificed and fought for to achieve for herself, and then had given up to give me a better chance, especially because we were away from her entire family. I feel like there were a lot of unintended, but very definitely felt expectations of justifying all of the sacrifice that went into like the life that I was living. And I think that that's a shared experience, regardless of what led parents to sacrifice for their children. So it's interesting that for me, I think it was born out of my mom's refugee experience, but for other people, it's born out of, like a parent like starting a business and working really hard and long hours to make sure that their child can go on to achieve things with more certainty than there was for them. So that was like a big thing for me in terms of expectations, was just like I felt an expectation of myself to make everything my mom had done feel worth it. And that's like a pretty impossible expectation to live up to. And I think a lot of children of parents who have sacrificed a lot for them struggle with, because how do you balance the desire and sense of obligation to do that with also like the desire to just like lead a life that is fulfilling to you as an individual? And I think ultimately like going into law and practicing law has been a nice balance of that, because there are things that feel like tethers to my mom's experience and that I know she'd be happy with and proud of, but it's not an exact replica of the choices she made, which I think can also sometimes be debilitating to try to emulate all the things she accomplished. So.
Well, what are some aspects about your Afghan culture, or even your mother's refugee status and that culture influenced you in your life most? And can you kind of walk us through those a bit, like how those impacted you?
Yeah, I think the biggest one, and I don't know how much of this is Afghan and how much of this is like the refugee experience, like you said, but sort of this collectivism. My mom raised me in such a way that even though we didn't have other family in our community when I was growing up, she was very focused on like mutual aid and like community building, and like there were constantly people that we were taking dinner over to. There was a sense of obligation to your neighbors and like desire to be in community with people that is present in some ways, like interpersonally in the United States, but not structurally in the United States in terms of like government and all of those things. And I don't know if it should or shouldn't be, but it was very different, the way like caring for others was not just like something we did because it was nice, but like was taught to me as like, this is what it means to exist in the world and in a society. And I think part of that too is like Islam is very community based. And so like the mosque was like a big source of where we found that. And the West is perhaps notoriously individualistic. And so it was interesting to like sort of be stepping in between both of those worlds, depending on if I was at school or if I was at home. It really did feel like a distinct difference in, yeah, just like the sense of duty that I felt to other people and where I was like deriving that from. And then I think like another big thing in Afghan culture, which may be surprising, but I think this goes back to what my mom grew up in as Afghanistan and like the reality that is growing up in Afghanistan right now. But when my mom was growing up, there was this huge enthusiasm and respect for the diversity of religions. And Afghanistan is predominantly undersells it. It's like 99.9% Sunni Muslim, but historically speaking, there's like huge roots of other religious traditions. The Bamyan Buddha statues, which some people may know of, are like a huge, they're no longer there because the Taliban destroyed them. But my mom grew up loving learning about the Buddhist history in Afghanistan and the like other Abrahamic traditions that are there and the tribal religions. And so that's a big part of Afghan culture that is not there anymore, but that I had instilled in me because my mom had been raised in it and her family had really loved exploring and understanding the diversity of beliefs around them and the history of them, which is probably how I ended up in world religions with Courtney as a freshman, if I think about it. But I think that's one of the big things that has that idea that even if you only identify one certain way, there's still so much to be gained from learning about and understanding the diversity of beliefs around you, I think is part of how I ended up in law, but also part of how I ended up with like 72 minors when I graduated from undergrad, including religious studies. And I think that is, it's not that that's not in the United States. I just think like I derived that value from my mom, so I attribute it to Afghan culture. But a common theme that's emerging, I'm realizing as I'm answering these questions, is to the point of intersectionality. I don't know what is exactly attributable to Afghan culture as opposed to just her intersection of identities that she sort of like socialized me with. So
I appreciate so much how you are complicating it, because it's, I think, this comes up so much, especially in courses that are about multiculturalism. And I experience this a lot in teaching world religions, is that people want it to be easy, right? Like they want to say, oh, people are acting this way because they are Sunni Muslim or they're Chinese Buddhist. And the reality is that we are messy people. And so cultures are messy. And so this gets into this big question that Bridget and I have been wondering about, is regarding misconceptions, because this is already getting to the sense that, cultures are conceptualized as being simplistic but yet we will accept ourselves as complicated individuals. So when you think about the misconceptions regarding Afghanistan and then also regarding refugees, especially in your new work in New York, what do you think are kind of key items and elements that need to be corrected beyond what we've already been talking about today?
Yeah, I mean, the big one just being that there are not like super broad strokes you can use with regard to anything as broad as an entire country like Afghanistan or the experience of like the refugee population. I talked about like, I think one of the biggest misconceptions that I try to be open about sharing and like push people to learn about is just like the fact that Afghanistan has not always been in the position that it's been in for much of our lifetimes. When the Soviets like invaded and then everything that has kind of like spawned for that, which has been now like what, 50, 60 years since a lot of that was getting started. It makes sense that that's the understanding people have had of Afghanistan. And had I not like had my mom teaching me about Afghan history, I would have no reason to know that before that there was this rich enjoyment of life. Kabul used to be called the Paris of Central Asia. Like it was a very modern, progressive, historically rich, religiously diverse place that had much to offer the world and still has a lot to offer, but because of oppressive governments and like many other things that would take their own presentation to get into, we only have this like one understanding and like monolithic idea of what Afghanistan is and is capable of being. But I think if you can zoom out enough to know how much it had achieved in the past, it becomes easier to consider like what it could get back to and what like the Afghan people, what motivates them. It's because they know, like kind of, I say this knowing it could trivialize the point I'm making, but I also think it might be a helpful analogy. I think about, so like I was born in 1995. The Huskers have not really been good since 1995, 1997. But like I still go to the games and I'm like, we're gonna win another national championship. Haven't won one since 97, but I like believe in earnest because of the lore and like history that has been shared with me that like it's a rebuilding year. I say, like bashing my head into a wall as we lose like very should have been easy games. But I think at the risk of trivializing something as significant as a country's potential to sort of like claw its way back to stability, it is sort of similar in how I feel of I have never known Afghanistan and in the context where it has been realizing its potential, but I know people and I love people who have taught me about everything that it's capable of being. And so that's the big misconception, is just that this is all Afghanistan is, was, and ever will be. That's the biggest one. I think also just that like the Taliban is in any way representative of most people's beliefs in Afghanistan. Certainly there are people who agree, but there are many more who disagree and to the risk of their lives advocate for their disagreement with that. A lot of them worked alongside American forces and are now like at great risk as they like try to evacuate in light of the withdrawal and everything happening. So that's a big one that I engage with personally and at work right now, working on the cases for people who interpreted for the US military or for media publications and community organizations. And with refugees in general, I think the most important misconception to address is just that like all things being equal, these people would not have wanted to leave their homes. Like there's a poem by a Somali woman who her family has left and now lives in London. Her name's Warsan Shire, and the poem is called Home. And it starts, we'll see if I can get this right, but it starts, no one leaves home unless home is the mouth of a shark. You don't run for the borders unless you see the whole city running with you. And I think drives home the point that like refugees would not have lightly left their homes, their ancestral lands, everyone they know, everything they love. And I think sometimes we can have a very reductive understanding of refugees as wanting to come to the United States. And certainly in the context of having fled their homes, yes, like they do want to be here. It is a better place for them to be, but they don't want that to be the situation that they're in. And certainly that was the case for my mom, who, even when she came to the US, came with the intention to go back and to use what she had learned to help build Afghanistan back, only to see it deteriorate further while she was here to the point where she could not go back. So I think that's the biggest misconception of refugees, is just the feelings that they have about having to leave everything that they've known and loved. And then the other thing I would say, yeah, I'm going to say it, is that geopolitically speaking, I think an important misconception or just tension to address is that a lot of the crises that spawn refugees to come to the United States or to Canada or to the UK or any number of countries, if you really were to like dig back, a lot of times it is like chickens coming home to roost. Like a lot of times there's a lot of things that we had a hand in or other countries had a hand in that, whether we could have ever known at the time, did contribute toward the situation that led people to need to seek refuge. And so I think that sometimes, while refugee resettlement is an amazing thing to do, and we should commend countries and communities for welcoming refugees, I sometimes think we're like overly benevolent about the way we are like self-congratulatory for doing it. And that in fact, like in the case of people who interpreted alongside US Army, like, what's the word? Like groups that were going on missions, like they're now at risk and their families are at risk because of their service to our country. And as much as it is like commendable to resettle them, it's also like the least we could do. And so I think just for me personally, that's something that I like to speak to with a lot of refugee crises, because there can be a frustration about the existence of these migrant populations. And while that's not like any one person's fault, there is something to be said for cause and effect, I guess.
Well, what kind of things do you think that Afghans, and particularly women, struggle with when they first came to Nebraska or come to the United States generally?
Yeah, that's a great question. And I think kind of depends on when they would be coming. So I think right now, like recently arriving Afghan women in particular, I think there is kind of a culture shock of like the freedom that they enjoy when they come here, because they have been under the oppressive thumb of groups like the Taliban for a good amount of time. And I think that it's a lot of change. It's a lot to take in, and adjusting to just the opportunities and the options in every facet of life can be very overwhelming. So I think that's one thing people struggle with. I also think that they struggle to understand just like Nebraska has such a warmth, like the whole Nebraska nice thing is very true, but people are very community oriented, and those communities can sometimes be kind of insular. So I think it's hard to know how to build those inroads to getting to know their community. And so programs that are around like opportunities for refugees to meet people who are outside their cultural community or outside the broader refugee community are really helpful and important for just like cultural orientation, but also just like the interpersonal intimidation of like going up to someone who is just more comfortable in the situation they're in and having to put yourself out there and like ask to get to know them or learn something from them. And so I think that one of the things people struggle with is just how to meet people who aren't in their same cultural group or their same mosque or things like that.
We still have more questions for Lima, and I could ask questions to Lima all day. But if folks that are joining us want to ask questions, if you want to put them in the chat, that would be great. As you know, we have about 15 minutes left, but if things have come up regarding anything that Lima has talked about, growing up in Nebraska, her work with refugees, her mom's experience, please do so. But in thinking about that, about community building, you know, that's such a importance to us at SEC, and we always want to know, what can we do? So as staff, as faculty, as students, what can we do to help, especially with Afghan refugees that are coming to Lincoln and to Nebraska more generally?
It's a great question, and I'm happy that it's being asked. I think there are some general and specific things that can be done. Specifically, if you're interested in working with welcoming incoming refugees, Afghan or otherwise, the organizations that do a lot of that would be Lutheran Family Services, Catholic Social Services, and then Refugee Empowerment Center. And I can write those in the chat if that would be helpful. Those are like the 3 resettlement agency services that are here, and they do a lot of programming aimed at building, just creating those opportunities for cross-cultural interaction, understanding, exchange, appreciation. I also just think part of it is attending events like this and putting on events like this so that cultural differences can be demystified to some extent, because I think when you haven't met someone of a certain culture, or you haven't like interacted with people who have had an experience like fleeing persecution, it can be, for better and for worse, a little bit intimidating to know, like, will I go into these interactions prepared to be thoughtful and to like not put my foot in my mouth, which I constantly am worried about when I'm entering new interactions. So I think seeking out opportunities to gain awareness about the refugee population in Nebraska and about Afghanistan specifically, if that's a population you're wanting to focus on, is really helpful so that you can, with more confidence and enthusiasm, go into those interactions. I think a big thing too is just, if you are in some way, your life is intersecting with refugee populations, whether you have kids who go to school with students who are refugees, which LPS has quite a few refugee families, especially at schools like Clinton Elementary School. Or if you are just involved in a church or another religious tradition that has refugee engagement as part of it, a lot of times it can feel like you have to do more than you really do. And something as small as just like saying hi to somebody who may not have connections outside of their refugee community can go a long way. And from there, you can kind of, on an interpersonal level, assess like, oh, is this somebody who would like benefit from me being helpful with securing transportation, or like in a less like service oriented way, is this just like somebody that I think it would be fun to go grab coffee with and sort of help them reach a point of normalcy? Because especially if they're recently arriving refugees, there's a lot of like re-traumatization that not having roots in a community sort of trigger over and over. And so sometimes it's just like interpersonally seeking out opportunities to interact with and establish connections with refugees helps them not only integrate into the community, but also process some of the trauma around having to leave one home and wondering if they're going to find what feels like another, especially because Nebraska is in some ways very similar and in some ways very different. And it can be intimidating to assess all of the differences. So I think that's the big thing, is just like, if you find yourself in an interpersonal context, they're humans too, and you can treat them accordingly, but doing some background work to understand perhaps like their culture and things like that can just go a long way in demonstrating a respect and a desire to learn about something that's important to them.
Yeah, you've alluded to this a couple of times, and I'm really curious because you've talked a little bit about how Nebraska and the Midwest could, it reminds people of home. Can you talk a little bit about that, of what your mom found or what you found, especially when talking to family?
Yeah. First of all, just in terms of weather, the seasons are very similar to Afghanistan. Very hot in the summer, a lot of snow in the winter. So a lot of refugee populations, they arrive and they haven't seen snow. And then Afghans are like, oh, snow, I love this stuff. Great, we got a place that like we can enjoy cool weather. And I do see the question in the chat, so I will answer that in a second. But another thing that is similar is, I do think like the Nebraska nice travel slogan that I've now quoted like 7 times on this call, that sense of warmth and welcome and like inviting people in for a meal, or staying after church or a mosque service or a class to ask people how their family are doing, that I think the Midwest has like a positive reputation for in the context of the United States, is also something that like is very true in Afghan culture. It's very like to the service of guests oriented. It's very like interpersonally engaged with people who you sit next to at work. Like you will ask them what they did for their weekend, and you will actually want to know the answer. You're not just asking as like a cursory thing. And so I think that side of like the interpersonal warmth and welcome is familiar for Afghans when they get here, and is like very comforting, not only because it's just like a nice behavior to demonstrate, but because it's a similarly engaging level of interaction. As Courtney has said, I just moved to New York City and I am constantly smiling at strangers on the street, only to realize they are very alarmed by me doing so. So I do think Afghanistan and the Midwest are a little more closely aligned on the like exuberance of friendship and fondness. And then I saw there was a message that got sent to me that was asking if there are any Afghan-owned restaurants in Lincoln and what year my mom came to Nebraska. So I definitely know the answer to the second question. I'm not actually sure about the answer to the first one. So my mom came in 1992. And so the civil wars were still going on. The Taliban did have a lot of power, but things had not deteriorated or consolidated as much in terms of like the Taliban being the like entity that was sort of in control. And so, yeah, that's when she came to Nebraska. And then Afghan-owned restaurants in Lincoln. I don't know. Courtney, do you know?
I think there's one in Omaha, but if anybody knows of others, I'll put the one in Omaha that I believe. But share those in the chat. That's a great place for the
Yeah,
chat.
I mean, I'll be home around the holidays and I want to know if there's Afghan food that I can acquire. So please do share that. In Omaha, there is a woman who does like catering named Mariam Berde, who's Afghan. And every time I go home to Omaha, I'm like, how many trays of Afghan food can I order from you while I'm home? I don't know if there are any Afghan-owned restaurants in Lincoln. But if I find out otherwise, I will tell Courtney so she can tell you.
Great. Yeah. Food's another interesting point of where cultures get homogenized and assume that like one, and then you get into the really the details of food to think about the differences of flavors and ingredients. And but it's another area where it's so much, it represents the complexity of cultures that I don't think people realize that.
Yeah.
Are there any?
Sorry, I was just going to say, I do appreciate the question about there being Afghan-owned restaurants in Lincoln, because I do think food is such a access point for people to interact with different cultures. And to Courtney's question about like what people can do to support refugees or welcome them, food, even if there aren't Afghan-owned restaurants, is like such a love language for Afghans, and I think for all people. But certainly Afghans say we don't eat to live, we live to eat. That's like one of their little quotes. And so I do think if you ever find yourself in the context of interacting with refugees, food is always like a nice opening topic because people are enthusiastic about it and eager to share a part of themselves that doesn't feel as, you know, like close to maybe their most like traumatic memories or things that sometimes they're being poked and prodded to talk about in first meetings. So food, always a good starting point.
I was wondering if Bridget, if you had any other questions kind of off the cuff, and then also to Lima, if there's anything that we didn't ask you that you would want people to know. So Bridget, start with you first. If there's anything else.
I was just curious. You said that earlier in your presentation that there's this obligation to your neighbors and to your family, and more of a communal understanding of, you know, interacting in the world. And I find when I'm teaching my classes that that's hard for a lot of Americans to even, you know, wrap their head around, because we are so individualistic, and not that we don't care about our families or communities, but you had said that you also got this at your mosque, and could you share a little bit more about that, about your religion and how it has influenced you in terms of, or even impacted your experience here?
Yeah, I definitely agree with what you said of like, it's not that in the United States people don't care about their families or don't care about their neighbors, but collectivist societies or communities, it's just like, I don't know, you internalize it in a different way, and the basis for the desire and the urge to do so is different in a way I don't have like the words to explain. But in terms of religion, so my family is like almost all of Afghanistan, Sunni Muslim. I myself am like still culturally quite Muslim, but I've never been particularly religious. My mom was very, very religious, taught women's rights in Islam at the College of St. Mary for a while. And my mom's dad was a Sufi, like Muslim, like philosopher, really enjoyed studying religion. And so while not spiritually significant for me in like the ways that like Islam is typically ascribed to, going to a mosque as a kid, I think was a huge part of my identity, because it was the only room I ever stepped foot in where I was not like the odd one out, or like having to explain or justify or be, as Courtney pointed out, like the voice on Islam, the voice on Afghanistan. So it was really helpful community in that way. I also think that in general, a lot of the Muslims in Omaha are recent refugees and maybe go one generation back. And so it was nice to be around other people who had that shared experience. I do think being Muslim was quite formative to my life in positive ways. And then also like being known as a Muslim was formative in my life in some negative ways, just as a result of Islamophobia being as rampant as it is. But it also gave me, I think, a greater capacity for empathy about that from a young age, because I was sort of thrust into it, whether I wanted to learn to be empathetic about religion at age 6, that's where we were. But I think that religion in general is like a really helpful, I don't know, like arena for me to learn about and have community in, even though I am not like in terms of like feeling a relationship with a God. That's not something that I personally have, but just the community sort of collectivist, like you said, nature of like service and acts and like high worship and mysticism were always like a really helpful tether to the fact that I was Afghan, and the fact that like I was not the only person who was different from a community around me that felt more than it really was, but certainly felt like everyone was exactly the same. And then there was me. So having the mosque was very helpful for having like a respite from that. Because also I went to West Side High School, and if you know anything about Omaha, that was not the place to be for like diversity at the time. So it was nice to have another community.
Is there anything we haven't asked you or you want to talk about that you're thinking of that you want to make sure that we acknowledge and address?
I don't think so. Oh, I would just say that like I've sort of touched on it a little bit, and maybe you all know this, but you're going to hear it again now. Nebraska has a lot to be proud of in terms of its refugee resettlement infrastructure and just identity. In 2016, Nebraska welcomed more refugees per capita than any other state, and continues to be just like an amazing ambassador for welcome and helping new Nebraskans feel like they do have a home somewhere after having that taken away from them in such a traumatic way often. And so, yeah, Nebraska has a lot to be proud of in that sense. And I am, yeah, very grateful for the opportunity to talk about this, because since leaving Nebraska, I don't often get to think about my identity as a Nebraskan and all these other things that people can more readily ascertain about me. So it's been nice to be back with my Nebraskan folks.
We've been so grateful to have you join us today and give us your expertise and experience. And people have indicated that the corner kitchen is where it's at in Lincoln. So that's a great, and owned by a former. Thank you so much, Lima, for joining us. And if people have questions or thoughts that stay with them, email them to me, and I'm happy to, I'll share them on to Lima. But thanks so much to everyone. Nicole, did you want to say anything? Take us out.
Thank you, everyone. We really appreciate it. This was an excellent week. Thank you so much to the whole team. Have a great weekend.